Hello and welcome to the Rask Network. What you're about to hear and see is limited to general financial information only. Please be sure to speak to your financial planner or refer to our financial services guide available at rask.com.au/FSG before acting on the information.
Welcome back to the podcast. Today, I'm joined by James Bowman from Inflection. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for having me back.
It's good to have you back. How's your day been today?
Good. I've had a delicious but very filling banh mi, so hopefully I get through this podcast and overcome my food coma.
Nice. It is very much a sandwich office, isn't it? Sandwiches, banh mi's.
You hate the sandwiches. I don't know. I don't get the hate. You just can't go wrong. It's a lunch food.
It is a lunch food. I know. Maybe I had too many sandwiches growing up as a kid.
I did have a lot of sandwiches growing up.
Maybe that's it. But today's episode is actually inspired by a recent reflection I had on my own life and how drastically it has changed over the past 12 months. So as you know, my husband and I, also named James, made the big move out of inner city Melbourne to a regional town about an hour and a half away. And obviously with that move, I was initially quite scared that I wouldn't make any friends, that it'd actually be really difficult to insert myself or the both of us into a new community and find a new community or just an existing community. But surprisingly, and even in the last 6 months, it's something that we've just formed really deep relationships and connections with the local community that I just kind of hadn't anticipated. And I think it's come from having a shared interest in the local area, really wanting to give back to the local community. And I think helping something to grow, which was just something I hadn't really experienced, in over a decade of sort of living in Melbourne. But it kind of got me thinking about the power of communities, both locally and globally, and how these connections are forged. And obviously, through shared interests and passions, but I think beyond just, where we went to school or where we work or what our job title is, which kind of brought us to today's topic over the last couple of weeks and really thinking about the incredible value that brands can build through community engagement.
For sure.
Which is something that I see business owners and companies quite often making the mistake of just sort of relegating it to the marketing team. And it's community engagement, it's to do with Instagram, it's to do with Twitter, it's to do with TikTok, whatever.
What's the ROI?
What's ROI? Let's put it in the marketing team. But I think it's so much bigger than that. And building a community around your business is like a core business strategy. It's not a marketing strategy. And it's not a marketing tactic, which I think it quite often gets kind of looked over as. So, and to prove it, I think today we're going to dive into a few really exciting case studies of some really powerful brands, household names that everyone will know of, that have really leveraged community engagement to grow their brand. So I'm really excited to chat through it today. And I know we have some really interesting case studies to get stuck into. And then over the next sort of 3 episodes, we are going to be interviewing local Australian business owners that have done this model and have built really successful communities around their brand. So we'll chat a little bit more on that later. But maybe before we do dive into it and the business side of that community building, I'm curious, James, to hear what your most memorable childhood experience or just general experience of being part of a community is.
Yeah, so I grew up playing a lot of sport. So while I don't have a specific memory, I do think they're a great example of building out a sense of community outside of the actual thing. So it's not just about, or at least when I was growing up at these clubs, it wasn't about just the 3 p.m. or 11 a.m. game.
Yeah.
It was also watching the other teams play that were a part of that club. And it was also what you did before and after training. And it was the social aspect on the Saturday night afterwards or on the Friday, the fundraisers, all the other outside of the sport things that you did for that sense of community and belonging and really shape behavior. There was a consistency and a cadence to that as well that was predictable, and people built their lives around that as much as kind of sport being, or the things around the sport being optional. It was everything else outside of that because it was so ingrained into the behavior of everyone involved in that kind of community. So I think that's a great example of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Sporting communities for sure. So I guess diving into sort of the first case study and brand that we want to talk about is we want to talk about a brand that is known for being a little bit more unconventional in their approach.
For sure.
And you wouldn't necessarily think of an airline, especially a budget airline, as a shining example of community building. But RyanAir, if anyone's been following along on socials, has really taken a completely different approach, focused really heavily on social media, and it's paying off big time.
Huge.
Yeah.
No.
So maybe we could dive a little bit into their strategy and how they decided what to focus on.
Yeah. I think Michael Corcoran's the guy who took over their social media around the time of COVID starting, just prior to that. So he's a really interesting guy to kind of research and look into. He's done some great interviews and different pieces. I don't think he's with RyanAir anymore, but he talks about the research he did when he first got to RyanAir and kind of using that research in kind of smart little categories that then helped inform the direction and the strategy for his whole team. So I'll run over those quickly. The 4 categories he put the research into were brand, category, or like the market, the customer, and then the social media landscape. So in terms of the brand, again, like you've alluded to, RyanAir has a very well-known reputation for being a bit witty, a bit irreverent. The CEO is very well known to kind of speak his mind and literally told customers to F off on Twitter and no, you won't get a refund. Like, they're pretty out there.
Yeah.
So that was a pretty identifiable piece in terms of brand. And then in terms of category at that time, and I think still to an extent now, he talks about how all the airlines, whether they were budget or luxury or anywhere in between, all had the very, very much the same marketing strategy in making things seem comfortable as possible, as aspirational and beautiful and luxurious and all those sorts of things. Like the budget airlines were trying to pretend to be that, and the luxury ones, that became the core purpose. And he's a bit crass. He simplifies it down to it's a big sweaty box that no one really is enjoying that much anyway. And the vast majority of people can't afford more than economy anyway. So it's a relatively similar experience for most people. And so dressing it up like the rest of the airlines didn't make sense. But that was very much the same across all the kind of airlines marketing. And then in terms of the customer, really interesting kind of perspective. They found that through all their surveys and research, the older generation who probably could remember a time before budget airlines existed and RyanAir came in the 80s, that they kind of democratized air travel. And so the older generation were kind of okay with the trade-offs of really budget travel because it allowed them to still travel when they might have not been able to previously. And then on the flip side, the Gen Zs or the youngest demographic were a bit more full of energy, also more broke, less money, and willing again for the trade-off of just the utility and the commodity of just getting to the place. They didn't need the frills and they're okay because they don't have money of just getting there. And again, the ability to travel. So yeah, and then the in-between age demo, the more millennial type, as our colleague Mitch says, they want the champagne, or they did want the champagne taste with the beer budget. So they had higher expectations of what the service would include, no matter how much you paid for it. And so that was kind of where it sat with their customer and the landscape for them at the time. And then essentially use those 4 categories and the research for those to then guide strategy from there.
Yeah, so interesting. And I know that, again, if anyone kind of follows through RyanAir, or if you haven't, have a look at their social media through Instagram and TikTok, because the way that they're kind of engaging with their community is really interesting and it's really funny. And I mean, it seems like they're really trying to address, like you said, the champagne taste on the beer budget, and they're really honing in on what they don't do.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is so interesting.
Yeah, it's running towards the limitations and being really open about that. And yeah, Michael Corcoran talks about that, where he says one of the problems that we're trying to solve based on what they identified in that research was education, or at least being more open and upfront about the trade-offs, so that they could shift the perspective or the consumer expectation of what a budget airline would include. And that involves being super, in a funny and engaging way, which they're very clever at doing, being upfront about what they do and don't do and what they will charge for. So really, really interesting way of kind of going about that. But yeah, it was all still kind of based on research and survey data and that sort of thing as well, to kind of make sure that was actually the problem.
Yeah. Do you know what kind of other problems, obviously the space that people were experiencing on the flight, but what other kind of problems or barriers do you think they had that they were trying to solve through this particular business strategy?
Yeah, I think cost, I mean, people find it really frustrating, I think, for them when they have to pay additional like cash for certain things, whether that be legroom or even for RyanAir's case, a window, or paying more for the side of the plane that sees the sunset versus paying less for the side of the plane that doesn't. And like that's actually things they do, or paying extra for like carry-on baggage or things like that, which seem really counterintuitive. And again, for certain demographics, that you feel like you're entitled to that thing. So they had to shift that's not an entitlement. And the trade-off is you'll get super, super cheap flights, like £10 flights, £15 flights, but you're going to get the absolute minimum for it.
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, I've definitely across from, when I was traveling at 21 years old and I had a backpack and I hit up RyanAir
100%.
Absolutely because it was the cheapest flight and all I had was a backpack. I did a 7-week hike through the kind of Pyrenees of Spain and I didn't need anything but a backpack. So it was a cheap flight. I didn't have to pay any of those extra leg rooms or anything like that. I would think I was just lucky that there was no one on the flight.
Totally.
So I ended up having kind of like a 3 rows to myself. But I mean, I think there's like an element of people expect more and maybe it's part of like conditioning that we just kind of, you get your fee and as a part of that, you get carry-on luggage. Whereas with RyanAir, it's like you get a backpack or a handbag.
Yep.
And if you want carry-on luggage, then that's additional.
Yep.
And if you want a suitcase, then that's additional again.
Yep.
But it means that if it caters to all different types of people, all different types of travelers.
Yeah, it does. And they're really being really open about that. It's all on the table. There's no sense of things being hidden or things kind of being a bit sly. If you're really upfront and clear on what a customer can expect, even if that would be a perceived limitation and a barrier for that business, they've turned that into a really open kind of deal or trade-off compared to a lot of other airlines.
And so obviously I remember seeing their first like engagement in social media and the way that they kind of really talk about these limitations, but are using it as almost like a value proposition or their, point of difference as a business, which I think is a really interesting way to do it.
Yeah.
But I remember when I first saw it, it was kind of, 1 or 2 little memes that were sort of popping up. And now it's just like the brand has grown, like the brand, how we think about it, how we engage with it. I think like the sort of like affiliation and like the fondness now that people have with the brand
100%.
I think is really interesting. It's really shaped different perspectives. And I think it's really changed the way that people see the brand as well.
And then to bring it back to that community element, it became the more they've developed this strategy and become really good at it developed this community of people, like a small microcosm of people that almost liked that they were the people who got RyanAir and became almost RyanAir defenders. So they started finding people who would be replying to complaining comments about, I had to pay extra for this, or this flight was delayed, or whatever that was. And they wouldn't reply. The customers that are really loyal to RyanAir replying, being like, did you read the terms and conditions? Like, or did you, like, you clearly didn't read this right, or you paid £10 for this flight. You shouldn't be complaining, basically.
Yes.
And that's a really, really interesting kind of development from the company itself explaining its own reasoning and its own value proposition to people getting it and explaining it for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in terms of growth, I know that their social media kind of took off.
Totally.
And I know that you've got a bit of an idea of some of those metrics and like what they saw since they really started with this business strategy.
Yeah, I mean, 2 million followers. I mean, they're 2.5 million TikTok followers now, but 2 million kind of in that first couple of years stretch was a huge amount of growth, especially for a corporate entity. They base a lot of their goals on impressions, so it's probably a bit more kind of lofty or undefined compared to a lot of small businesses out there because they could afford to just kind of focus on brand awareness and impressions. But even based on that metric, we're going from like 5 million weekly impressions to 30 million on average. So
that's insane.
Crazy growth. And in that 18-month period, they reckon it was about 2 billion impressions organically without any kind of paid out assistance.
That is wild.
Just wild. Yeah, so huge amount of growth. And they get really granular with that. Like they would do content or post content that wasn't really about the airline at all, but they felt like could be viral. And then they'd have different strategies for that versus their everyday content that would really deliberately and quickly follow up from the viral content, because I felt like viral content would kind of get them to this new kind of demographic or group of people they wouldn't usually get to, and then quickly follow up with their everyday content that was still engaging, still entertaining, but would again try and kind of keep pulling in those new people that the viral content's kind of introduced to the brand.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
a really interesting concept.
Yeah, really interesting. I guess it really hones into that storytelling component as well, and really bringing your customers into the conversation, which I know they did quite well, and they really focused on storytelling. And the other brand that we really want to talk about is Red Bull, which kind of takes it that step further.
Yeah. They really apply this concept of really story doing or story kind of performing versus storytelling. So not just explaining your side as the business or the brand, but making or encouraging your community to participate in the brand story itself. So they've been really, really clever at doing that kind of their whole history since the 80s. I didn't realize they've been around that long, but been really good at innovating and targeting different demographics that whole time.
Yeah, so I think like at the moment or recently, I mean, I remember back when there were, the Red Bull gives you wings sketches ads on TV, but you very rarely see their product being pushed online anymore. Like their social media page isn't product focused. It's not come and, buy our beverages.
No.
Their narrative really seems to have shifted from being a beverage company into even like an events organization.
Yeah. A lot of people call them like a media agency or a media kind of company, because really interestingly, they never brought production or logistics and a lot of that other kind of business side of it in-house. They don't own the warehouses or things like that, because they spend so much time, energy and resource on the marketing and the selling of the product, and very little into kind of product innovation. The product itself hasn't changed that much in 40 years. And you compare that to some of the other beverages, like I know Coca-Cola don't own a lot of their manufacturing, warehousing or whatever that is, but they do innovate their product a lot more. Like they do have a lot of more variations of their product or promotions or things like that, and probably do focus a little bit more on their taste. And obviously have done that super well. But conversely or inversely, Red Bull have put very little time and effort into innovating the product. It's all about creating a feeling and a community and a customer experience more than like how long the energy kick lasts or the taste or whatever the specifics of the drink are. Yeah,
it's never really, quite often in marketing we'll talk about like features versus benefits, features being like the tech specs, the tangible things of the product, and then the benefits of those like intangible, emotional things. They don't even really focus on those, which is like a core marketing principle. Yeah. It's like they've actually shifted away from the product completely and just kind of really created this community around, at the moment, like sports and like sporting events and sports teams. Yeah, sports teams, they sponsor pilots, they sponsor kind of extreme sports, music, kind of so many forayed into so many different things that it's, we were talking about an example even earlier when back in the day they used to like go to events or hold events but spread empty cans, like empty Red Bull cans around the event to kind of create the feeling that it's being drunk a lot. Yeah. Which is, no one's going to buy a Red Bull can straight after that because they're seeing that, but it is planting in the back of people's minds that people at these events that I like to be at with people I like are drinking this beverage. And the same sort of concept being applied and just kind of creating constant brand awareness and constant brand visibility in these kind of sub-communities as a way of kind of growing their beverage or growing their selling proposition. Yeah, and it really goes back to, what we were talking about earlier, and the experience that I've even had recently in my own community is it's like a shared interest. That's what's bringing people together. It's not the product that's bringing people together. It's the community and the shared interest of what that community is doing. Yeah. Whether it be like extreme sports, whether it be, they own like footy teams and stuff. Yeah. Like, so it really is just such a different way to build a business. It is. And it's amazing how little time they put into the actual business itself versus the selling and the marketing. In terms of encouraging, to go back to what you mentioned before about what their social media actually is, again, there's barely anything, if anything, about the actual product. It's all about celebrating people who are
enacting the feeling they're trying to create in their customer. So it's people doing the extreme sports. It's people who are a bit risk-taking or passionate about certain things, or really kind of bold people, and appealing to people who do that and celebrating people who are acting that feeling of like Red Bull gives you wings, and really just rallying behind that slogan. So there's nothing pushing you towards this store sells Red Bulls on their Instagram page or on their website. It's all about people who are enacting their catch call and rallying people behind that and celebrating that.
Yeah. And even I guess like going into those extreme sports, but just like those really heavily fanatical sports like F1, they own like F1 teams. And this isn't my zone of genius in terms of the sporting world, but I do know that, we were talking about it a little bit earlier, that they do own some of these teams.
Yeah. They own heaps of teams across heaps of different sports. They own like 5 soccer teams, heavily invested in a 6th in the UK at the moment. Literally the New York soccer team they own, the mascot is Red Bulls. So they're like the New York Red Bulls. And people at the time in the early 2000s were like, you cannot rename our team the Red Bulls. Like, this is so corporatized and it's just yuck. But it's so normalized now because they've been really consistent in building their brand into these communities and into these events. That's a normal thing. Yeah. And they sponsored a guy in 2012 jumping from space. I don't know if you remember that, but he jumped from space, and they paid something ridiculous, like $50 million over 5 years to kind of set this thing up. But it was their thing. Like, they owned it. They sponsored the guy. And if you go on YouTube, it's the Red Bull like space jump, like posted by the BBC, and it's got crazy amount of views. Like, it's like 146 million views.
Wow.
Since then. It had 8 million views of people watching it live. So at the time, of course, like for a beverage company to invest that much money in someone jumping from space is just like such a wildly out there concept.
Yeah.
But without being able to calculate a direct ROI, you can be pretty confident that the awareness they gained out of doing things like that is just so much further reaching than traditional kind of advertising and really just pushing their product.
Yeah. And I think it really goes into that kind of narrative of like, you don't want to go to people and say, buy my product, like buy from me, please.
Yes.
It's like you want people to come to you and be like, how can I buy your product? How can I work with you? And it's like creating this entire community of people around something that they're doing and enjoying anyway. But it's like, hey, we also like that.
Yep.
Let's rally together and let's see how big we can make this thing.
Yeah.
Rather than being like, oh, hey, we're Red Bull.
Yes.
Drink this drink or concoction and it'll make you do these things. It's, really getting into what people are interested in.
Yeah. Yeah. And targeting kind of the edge of these communities. It's not going broad and trying to appeal to everyone, because if originally they thought it was going to be a bit of an alternative to coffee, like coming out of Thailand as a beverage that was invented back then. But if they tried to market it as an alternative to coffee and just to anyone who drank coffee, it's so broad, it's kind of nothing. By originally they were going after like college kids and universities and getting people to hand out products at the beaches and all those kinds of things, the little Volkswagen Beetles with the big Red Bull can on the back, like all that stuff that we remember, very, very deliberately in investing in influential people, but not a specific subset that they thought could then influence others versus trying to appeal to everyone.
Yep. Yeah, interesting. And I mean, you just kind of spoke, and I guess we haven't really spoken about drinking the product, but you kind of just brought it up. And it like brings me back to, and I feel like we can't talk about Red Bull without talking about like the classic Red Bull vodka shot, which like what a grim part of being 18 it was, but it was just a part of being 18.
Absolutely.
But I mean, I don't even know where these came from. I don't know if it was a part of that strategy and engaging with those students, but I feel like there was such a push behind these Red Bull products being a nightclub energy thing.
Yeah, well, they really went after early days, but still today really, after like student kind of ambassadors who were ideally influential or quote unquote popular people, to then go do the handing out and the marketing for them and partner with Red Bull to be a part of their story and get the product in people's hands. So in that early stages, it was just kind of getting into bartenders' hands and making a cool drink that people were drinking in that age demographic who generally frequented nightclubs or bars, And then, of course, bartenders are going to start catering to that if it's a really heavily drunk beverage. So again, ingraining itself into the culture versus selling, hard selling, I guess. It's all soft selling. It's all guerrilla marketing, kind of seeping in and ingratiating itself into this culture rather than.
Yeah. And I feel like there's been so many competitors that have popped up over the time, like, you know, Monster and V, and, you know, Monster's done its own kind of thing. But I feel like V kind of became a big thing when I was about like, I don't know, even when I was maybe like 17.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's still like Red Bull's just the thing that it's still just out there and it's doing something, but it's not pushing a product. You know, you never really see billboards or like, you know, banners on buses and, you know, things in 7-Eleven, but you still do see that for like V as an energy drink.
Yeah, because they know they're going to have so many different touch points with their target demographic in all these different circumstances, all these different sports, all these different kind of, again, into music now, they own their own production house. So they're on YouTube, like really heavily invested in that and onto their socials and competitions and events they sponsor. So they have so many touch points with you organically, they don't need to do the hard selling nearly as much. And their traditional marketing budget is really low in comparison to their kind of what they call like ongoing brand investments, which probably are somewhat loss leaders buying all these clubs. They will go up in value. Like I know the New York soccer team has gone up probably 10 times in value since they bought it in 2005. But compared to the drink sales, it's far outweighed. They are still very reliant on the drink sales, but they're selling that in a way that's just kind of a part of all these cultures.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I mean, I'm so keen to, like, as we kind of bring in other Australian businesses through these conversations that have done this, because it's not the common way that businesses go about building their brand. It's pretty uncommon that we see businesses creating a community, a shared community, again, around that shared interest, and it not actually being a product push. There is like an Australian business that we're going to be chatting to on the podcast as well later on in this mini series, talking about community engagement. But I think also it just kind of brings to my mind like Patagonia as like another example, which like phenomenal business in its own right, in terms of their culture and like the way that they kind of run their business. They do like when there's a good surf day, it's like office is closed. And so it's just a really interesting way. But when you think about Patagonia, you do think about the products, but it's also like, what is the lifestyle? What is like the values of the people? And if you're a Patagonia fan, it's like you're a diehard Patagonia fan and you'll buy that product. You know, think Owen, he owns like, I don't know, 10 Patagonia shirts that he bought it recently in all the different colors. But yeah, I think it's just like a really interesting, these businesses that really engage and really focus on building community, which, you know, at the end of the day, it's like, even translating it back to like personal life, it's like, it's why we exist. You know, habitually we are like herd animals. We want to be around people. We want to be with people. We want to have shared experiences. And I think these communities and these businesses that are building these communities are just really honing into something that we want biologically. And that's why it is such a great business strategy.
Yeah. And I think organic social media is like an extension of all that and that need where people do want that. And the RyanAir guy, Michael Corcoran, breaks it down in terms of how that relates to organic social media being you're either there to be entertained or you're there to kind of escape your everyday life, and you want to kind of have emotion evoked, whether that be kind of joy or anger or sadness or just kind of to escape and be entertained. So that is a way of kind of engaging your community. And if you're trying to engage your community on socials that is not those two things, the two core reasons people are on social media in the first place, you're kind of in the whitewash. You're becoming a bit of a wallpaper. So really interesting how you can use organic social media in that example to create that sense of community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like as we sort of wrap up today's episode and like bringing it back home to if businesses were wanting to implement some of these tactics and strategies into their own business, obviously there's a few different ways thinking about Red Bull, you know, and RyanAir, like, you know, don't be afraid of what you don't do or can't do as a business. I think it's a really interesting one. And I think quite often we get caught up in wanting to be better than our competitors and beat them and have a higher quality product and have a longer returns period or whatever it might be.
Well, we don't mention this. Like, I think the people that do really good ads at the moment, I've seen, I think it's I Love Ugly, who I like their ads, a retail brand. They've run an ad recently where it was like just a picture of their pants with an overlay text of 1 star and the review being like too expensive. But then the whole ad's purpose is talking about why it costs more for them to make that pair of pants and why you'd want that and why it's going to last you and why it's worth that money.
Yeah.
So you can turn the things you think are the limitations of your brand into like the reason, to build the reason and build kind of your brand story, I guess.
Yeah, and use it as your point of difference and the thing that really sets you apart. Because, yeah, cool, maybe you might be an extra $25 to your competitors and there are going to be the people that are going to be judging you based on price. But if you can really hone in and really showcase why, whether it's to do with the product itself, whether it's to do with like ethical, sustainable business practices and manufacturing processes, then it goes back to that education component.
Yep.
And, you know, I think it's just such an important way of shifting the narrative and shifting the perception that we have sometimes. So I think, yeah, don't be afraid of what you don't do or what you can't do. Really be open with your customers and use it as a point of difference. And then I think, you know, going back to Red Bull, like thinking about the last time that you actually genuinely engaged with your community and not in an engagement of like, what product do you want next?
Yeah.
What do you want to see more of? But actually an engagement where you're putting the individuals and heroing their story as part of your narrative. And I think there's a really interesting episode that we did a couple of weeks ago, might even be a month ago now, with Beth Wilson from St. Jack. And that was just such an interesting conversation because she's an incredible content creator and she's created these really engaging relationships with her community, again, outside of the product itself. And it just goes so far beyond like transactional engagements, which I think is, you know, when we think about consumer psychology, like no one wants to be sold to. So if you can create a community that really creates this strong affiliation with your brand, then you're not actually selling your brand. And so Beth talks about that really well. We'll put a link in the show notes because I think that's a really interesting one to go back and revisit. And then I think also always remembering the purpose, like you said earlier, of like social media, like what are you putting out there? Is it engaging? Is it evocative? Is it escapist? Is it just selling something? Is it just to put a post out because you said you were going to put one post out every day? And I think really coming back to what's the purpose of your social media page? Why is your community using it? And what do they want to be kind of getting from that piece of communication?
Yeah. And I think that last piece is really important because so many of the small businesses I talk to get caught on I'm a X type of business. No one wants to see content about my day or what I'm doing. And it's just so far from the reality now. I was with a friend over the weekend who is addicted to this YouTube series that a farmer does in the US. And he's just like cleaning tractors and harvesting grains and doing really, really boring things. But this guy gets millions of views and would make more from YouTube than his farm now because he's showed that process and found a community that enjoys watching that. In the same way that, there's a guy who mows lawns, like surprises people and mows their like really overgrown lawns and it's completely crowdfunded. Like he does that because people just want to watch it and then will pay to support it. In the same way that, people cleaning things is really, really satisfying. Those just really satisfying videos you get on like Instagram Reels, people watch that. So I think no matter what the industry is, people are curious and generally a bit voyeuristic about what it would be like to live in someone else's shoes. So they do want to hear about your brand, your story, what you do, what you think. And I think that's really powerful.
Yeah. And I think, going back to a brand in Australia that does it really well is Zorali, in the sense of like they are an Australian-based business, outdoors clothing and kind of accessories and products and tents and those kinds of things. But they do a lot of community events where it'll be like a camp out weekend. There's zero focus on the product themselves. Everyone brings their own tent and a whole group of people, could be like 30 or 50 people, go to a particular location and you just do things in nature. So it's like you might, I went to one a couple of months ago and it was like you go and you plant trees and then you do like a nature walk and then you do like a community building and like a group bonding experience. And it's just, obviously you get to meet the owners and you kind of have those conversations and you really start to build this affiliation with the brand, but it's also building a relationship with the people that created that brand.
Totally.
And then obviously how you feel about the product is, elevated because you've had this really one-on-one, again, I guess going back to a lot of stuff that we talk about, like tailored one-on-one experiences, bringing people together. And yeah, they're a business in a company that do it really, really well at the moment. So
100%.
I mean, I think finally I would just say that like if anyone is listening to this episode and they want a little bit more advice on like different strategies to implement within their community, how they can get started, how they can like leverage their community, come and chat with us in the Inflection community. It's free. It's filled with hundreds of business owners that you can learn from and you can chat with. Plus we're all in there daily sharing resources, responding to questions. We'll put a link in the show notes, but it's just essentially an opportunity for you to network with other people and start building a community of your own and understanding what it feels like to belong to something.
Yeah. I think it's really powerful to have those shared experiences as business owners because it can feel really lonely. So to have a place where you can kind of ask questions judgment-free and just get thoughts is really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for today, James. It was great to chat.
Thanks for having me, Zara.
Thanks for watching this video on the Rask Network. While you're here, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can get videos each and every day on business, finance, investing, and so much more.